This is the most bizarre motherboard we've ever worked with. Back in March, we took a trip to the Shenzhen SEGE market where we negotiated over the $60 board that you see here. We thought it was X79, except it's actually a monstrous combination of hardware that isn't technically compatible. Somehow, the desktop Q77 chipset, LGA 2011 socket, old Xeon CPU, and mismatched capacitors do technically work. And we've also accidentally discovered a Russian enthusiast overclocking scene for this Chinese motherboard that probably uses desoldered chipsets from the alleys in Shenzhen. It's one of the most bizarre component combinations we've ever worked with and breaks all the rules we didn't think could be broken. But that's what makes the motherboard, simply named Motherboard on the box that came with it, so much fun to work with. This mystery board isn't even guaranteed a particular chipset and can come with any of 7 options. Today, we'll look at Motherboard. Before that, this video is brought to you by Gigabyte's X570 Master motherboard. The X570 Master is what we used for all of our Ryzen 3000 CPU reviews and for extreme overclocking streams with the 3900X. The Master is built to handle more current than you'll push through your Ryzen CPUs. It has actual finned heatsinks for the VRMs, and it features a massively overhauled Gigabyte BIOS. Pick up the X570 Master for your Ryzen 3000 CPU at the link in the description below. There's a thriving market for dirt cheap Xeons in general, but especially so in Asia. In Taiwan, if you're ever there, you can go to the Guanhua Digital Plaza in Taipei, or near it anyway, and pick up all kinds of old used components for relatively cheap. The newer stuff is more expensive there, but it's the used market that's particularly exciting. In China, you have the Shenzhen SEGE market. We've done tour videos on it. In Japan, there's marketplaces as well. So Xeons in particular are popular in almost all of these locations. And you think of all the old decommissioned servers, it makes a lot of sense. So when we visited in March, we did pick up this board, but we didn't do anything with it until recently because it's such a strange combination of things that it really took some research to dig into who even brands it, because there's nothing on the board to signify that much. So we cobbled together this setup of components from decommissioned server hardware. The board was somewhere around $60 back when we bought it in March, and we've covered a few of these things before, like the Huaninger dual socket X79 board, or X79, again in quotes there. It's actually the Intel chipset C606, but X79 is used to signify what processors can be expected to work on it. That board caused us endless frustration and is the reason we have more old Xeon hardware than we know what to do with, because we had to keep acquiring parts to try and figure out what was wrong with it. We ended up with 3 E5 2697 V2 Xeons, which were 12-core CPUs that were very expensive when they were new, but are really not that bad now, under the $100, $200 maybe max. 2 dual-socket boards. We got a bunch of DDR3 ECC memory that we'll never know what to do with. Surprisingly, the Huaninger board wasn't even the problem. So anyway, now we're moving on to the Plex HD X79 Turbo, and this is important, V1.01. So we picked this one up in Shenzhen at the SEG market, and we have videos touring that marketplace if you're curious about it. And it was a small price to pay to bring you, our viewers, cutting-edge content about 8-year-old chipsets. And that starts with the names. The names here are meaningless. We don't know who put this board together, and our board isn't actually branded Plex HD anywhere, but it's identical to models that are. As with the Huaninger board, it's not actually X79, and most sellers don't claim that it is. X79 is just a convenient way to communicate which CPUs are probably compatible. Ours came with a Q77 chipset. It's sort of like a roulette of what you'll get, but an AliExpress listing claims that B75, P75, Q75, H77, Q77, C204, or C206 are all possible chipsets that are installed purely based on availability. You don't know which you'll get. The Q77 chipset was designed for LGA 1155 boards, but here it is in a 2011 board paired with a Xeon, and it works just fine, mostly. Here's an explanation from one AliExpress seller that manages to convey its own weary annoyance despite the language barrier. Quote, "The Northbridge chip is Intel Sandy Bridge EP and integrated with the motherboard. Users can test it with softwares. The Southbridge chip is not the one that defines what the motherboard is. That's why it could range from B75 to Q75 or C204 to C206. This is technology common sense. Southbridge chip is in charge of communication of I/O mainline, such as PCI mainline, USB, LAN, ATA, SATA, audio controller, keyboard controller, etc. These are relatively stable, so a different version of motherboard may have the same Southbridge chip. The difference is the main chip, namely the Northbridge chip. And reading that is kind of like probably when we respond to comments, so we can understand, we can sense the annoyance in the seller's listing where people probably complained about getting chipsets on the boards that they don't expect. Now, note, we bought ours in person, so it was a different experience where buying it, my Chinese was much worse in March than it is today, and it's not great today either. But I've been working on it though. But in March, the experience was mostly, I would like to buy that. How much is it? Can you give me a discount? And there was no exchange of information beyond the sellers very kindly encouraging us to purchase specific components with the board to make sure it all worked together. So they did stop us when we tried to buy stuff that wouldn't work with it. So anyway, with a selection of chipsets this wide, board features will obviously vary quite a bit. The labels printed on the PCB are very optimistic. For example, PCIe 3 is one of them. We did indeed get some USB 3.0 ports and SATA 6 gigabit per second or SATA 3 capability ports, but our PCIe slots ran at 2.0 by 16 speeds despite being listed physically on the board as PCIe Gen 3. So that is quite the difference. We didn't try running SLI. The board does have a supplemental 6-pin power connector if you wanted it for multi-GPU, and it even has an NVIDIA SLI badge on it, which if you didn't know, probably we'll reveal this another time, but it's quite expensive per year to get that badge. And they probably didn't pay for this one. So clearly what we've learned here, if nothing else, is that you don't need to pay NVIDIA for a fancy SLI supported badge on your motherboard. You can just put it on there and then NVIDIA can deal with it, apparently was the solution here. So we also got quad channel memory compatibility as advertised, which is actually better than we expected. And the business-oriented stock BIOS has no XMP options. It supports 1866 megahertz as the fastest frequency on DDR3 that we could set, but we turned to a Russian overclocking forum, which is actually the only one we could find with this board explicitly detailed, and we found some solutions to that problem. Even the board components are a mixed bag. We spotted mixed capacitor choices within different capacitor banks in the VRM across the board, and those are just the components that are big enough to read the labels on. The PCIe slot outlines printed on the PCB have one type of latch, and the ones that are actually installed have another. From the same annoyed-sounding AliExpress seller that we quoted earlier, there's this notice. Quote, due to a different production batch, X79 motherboard might probably have slightly different design, such as different memory slots, color, or SATA ports, position, or motherboard version, etc. Our aim is to gradually make it more powerful. We will not make any further notice. End quote. There are almost no SMDs on the back of the board at all. And by almost, we mean there are only a few decorative LEDs, not even any capacitors behind the CPU socket. Very rare to see that. The VRM and chipset heatsinks are almost certainly borrowed from another name brand board. They look perhaps gigabyte-y, but we aren't 100% sure. And these LEDs and heatsinks, along with the cheerful post-beep fanfare that plays on every boot, suggest that this is something more than a collection of surplus server parts. The PCB itself is almost exactly the size of a sheet of letter paper, 8.5 by 11. There's your motherboard form factor. Not a standard form factor, not ATX, mind you. So that is the size of the motherboard. This is a really rare member of Intel's dead mini ATX form factor, and that's not a typo on our part in the script. We don't know how many others there have been because searching for mini ATX is impossible. You can try it yourself, but Google inevitably guides you back to the mini ITX or micro ATX results. In the words of Wikipedia, there is no widely accepted form factor by this name. We can assume there was at least one, and that it flopped, and that the tooling and solder masks got sold to an enterprising Chinese factory for cheap. Despite shortcomings, the I/O on the board is actually pretty good. First and foremost, Motherboard has an M.2 NVMe slot that actually did allow us to boot from a proper NVMe drive, which is much more than we'd expect from a board like this that's sold for about $60 with old hardware. There are 3 full-length PCIe slots, even if the transfer rates are stuck one generation down from what's advertised. There are 8 onboard USB ports, 2 of which are supposedly USB 3.0, with 2 additional 2.0 headers and 1 3.0 header on the board. 2 SATA ports are marked as 6 gigabits per second. Obviously, all of the specs have to be taken with a grain of salt, but the Q77 chipset is capable of most of the claims printed on the board except PCIe Gen 3, and then the rest is handled by the CPU on that end, and sort of the motherboard because it didn't work. And the BIOS options seem to back them up. There are even onboard power and reset buttons, something that's not always true of name brand budget boards, or even expensive name brand boards. It should be present on all of them, but these are often features relegated to $150 motherboards or more. The only connection we really felt the lack of was fan headers. There are only 3, and 2 of them are on the bottom edge of the board. Let's get into some of the fun modding stuff. So first of all, testing. We did technically benchmark one of our many E5 2697 V2s in this board for some other content, but there's no point in talking about those results today because there's nothing to compare them to. All that matters from that is that it worked, it ran the tests, and it was reasonably within expected performance. The generation of PCI is a bit of a limiter there in some workloads. But this is a motherboard review, not a CPU review, and ultimately we're more focused on the weird factor of the motherboard than anything else. So, suffice it to say, all the games and synthetic tests from our normal CPU bench ran without any obvious issue, and as expected, and the board did not catch fire. It's a very good performance from motherboard. PCIe Gen 2 is fine, sort of, and our non-ECC memory ran at 1866 megahertz in quad channel without a hitch. Most of the information we've gathered on this motherboard is from the Russian-speaking websites, notably the forum at overclockers.ru. For some reason, Russian sites have the most meticulous breakdowns of these off-brand Chinese boards, and the same was true for the Huananger X79 board we bought. The hobbyists at overclockers.ru have gone so far as to post modified BIOS files to allow memory overclocking and other features on these platforms in a thread that is, at the time of this writing, an impressive 873 pages long. There are several flavors of BIOS available for download for the X79 Turbo. They mostly fall into 2 groups. Updated versions of the stock BIOS, which allows DRAM frequency adjustment up to 1866 megahertz and maybe CPU overclocking. We didn't try this because we were mostly using a locked Xeon, or a lightly modded BIOS that allows memory multiplier overclocking up to 2133 and some individual adjustment of memory timings. These modded BIOSes seem to be revealing an existing hidden feature rather than building it entirely from scratch. We picked the one created by modder Mierval, M-I-E-R-V-A-L, shout out to you, because it's had some additional UI work done to tidy things up. The flashing process was embarrassingly easy. We reached out for some help with Russian translation to some of our contacts and held off attempting the flash until we were sure that it would actually work and until we were sure that we were done benchmarking it. But in the end, we did try it, and it took under 10 minutes to boot into a DOS prompt from USB key, the old way to flash BIOS, and enter one command to dump the existing BIOS for safekeeping, and then a second to flash it. And the new one actually did hold, and it worked. We tried 2 different .bin files. Both worked perfectly. Mierval's mod allowed us to attempt to run our memory at 2133. It's rated for 2400, which unfortunately didn't work, but it still gave us the option. We then dug an i7-4960X out of our production system, one of them, since it's the only compatible unlocked chip we own from this generation, and it did indeed allow us to set CPU frequency multipliers for 6-core turbo, 5-core, 4-core, and so forth. The important thing to remember is that this board can't overclock locked Xeons, regardless of whether the BIOS is modded or not, so there are some rules that you still can't break. The board can do some basic multiplier changes on the other chips, but that's not particularly special, although at the price, with the mods out there, it becomes really fun to play with. So the board is clearly intended to be paired with cheap second-hand Xeons, which can't be overclocked, and that may be a good thing given the quality of the board components, which leads us to our next segment. Every time we work on a weird motherboard like this, or video card, the audience asks us to send it over to Buildroid for analysis. So, this time we've finally given in, and we inflicted one of these weird components on him and asked for some quick Buildroid-style analysis of the parts on the board. And if you want to check his channel out, we'll link it in the description below as well. Here's how that interaction went down. Buildroid's first curiosity was about the lack of capacitors on the backside of the socket, so we sent him additional photos of the socket topside for more inspection. After looking things over further and asking about some of the component names, we got a few hot takes from the PCB analyst. Quote, "The MOSFETs are surprisingly decent. The inductors are concerning. To save cost, they evidently went for a one-size-fits-all. They are either very inadequate for V-core or totally overkill for VDDR. And at 800 nanohenries, I'm leaning toward them being crap for V-core. Also, the caps are cap exons, 2000 hours at 105C, but still polymers. Also, the VRM, while surprisingly decent, is still kind of crap overall. The 32 nanometer 6 cores are absolutely insane power hogs, upwards of 300 watts on 1.4 volts, but by cheap B450 motherboard standards, the VRM is actually pretty good. Also, they have fuses all over the place, I assume to aid repair." And then Buildroid gave us some instructions on how we could probably blow the board up if we wanted to. So there's your quick version of a Buildroid analysis on a Chinese board with a large Russian overclocking scene for something a bit unique. Anyway, all of this said, based on how much the hardware varies board to board, we can't recommend this to anyone if you actually have something specific you want to build. Maybe if you're there in person and you can validate what's on it. But otherwise, it's just roulette. All you're doing is taking a chance on what you're going to get. So the branding is typically X79. That's to signify the CPU and socket compatibility. And then the chipsets are random. If you're intending to use high-end Core series processors or do any overclocking, you should buy something else. We can recommend this as a $60-ish, maybe $70-ish toy to play around with a very active community that will require you to use Google Translate to get involved with, unless you speak and read Russian. And it's especially fun because compatible Xeon processors are so cheap on eBay. And to be clear here, we did look around on English-speaking forums just to see if this is kind of infiltrated anywhere else on the web, like overclockers.net. We checked OC UK, some other places, and unless it's been listed elsewhere under a different name, we can't find it, except for that overclockers.ru forum and that one AliExpress page. Because this board, as a reminder, doesn't have a name on it. So all we have is sort of a serial number, or a product ID number rather, and it says X79 Turbo V1.01, but there's no company name attached to that, and it's not particularly easy to find out there other than the couple places we spotted it. So it's fun to play with, it's weird, it's different, and it gives us a bit of insight as to what can be done with motherboards. So I was speaking with Buildroid about, wouldn't it be fun if some of the companies would do reruns or like additional print limited runs of old overclocking motherboards, because as Buildroid was telling me, so much of the overclocking scene is based on old hardware, and it's hard to get some of that stuff. And then you see stuff like this where there are actually places in Shenzhen, for example, where you can find desoldered chipsets from motherboards that can then be put on a new product, which might be what's happening here. We're not 100% certain, but that would kind of fit what's going on. So it's all very interesting because this cuts out the middleman, or not even really. It's like your first-party supplier, not even a middleman. It cuts out Intel is what it does. And you get the chipset from someone else and throw it on a board and cobble something together that works in a market where you go walk around in the tech marketplaces in, again, Taiwan or China, for example, and the used parts are so readily available, and the new stuff is more expensive than it is in the US. Even though it's made there, that doesn't matter. The US is still a larger consumer of this stuff, and so even though in Taiwan you could probably drive to Lian Li's case factory, for example, a lot of the components are still more expensive there. And that helps this used market thrive, because suddenly you can buy $60 motherboards, $56 Xeon CPUs that objectively were very good when they launched and were $2,000 when they launched, and cobble something fun together. So anyway, it might be fun for you to check out. We'll post links in the description below, but it's not something we can particularly recommend. It's just kind of weird and interesting. Anyway, this is a surprisingly versatile platform. It's not really small form factor, but it's not ATX, it's mini ATX. and it can run ECC memory. The components aren't necessarily as cheap as they should be, but it's overall fine. So that's our review of Motherboard, the Motherboard. Thank you for watching. If you have requests for other weird components like this one, post them in the comments below. We will check through them. And we have more stuff that we've bought on our trips to different parts of Asia that were just unique. We'll be looking at those more over the next few months as we ramp into more trips for next year. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to fund our addiction to stuff like this, weird hardware that we want to keep buying. Or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. I'll see you all next time.